Hey guys, Scott Adams here again. So, what one of my computer teachers, the first one I ever had actually, said a lot was, good data in is good data out. Or the opposite, bad data in is bad data out. And then, of course, every other computer instructor, professor, etc. said that. And you hear it all the time. Now, it makes sense for engineers thinking this way, but what about all of us? What about people just in the fraud and risk and payment space? So I've been running across this a lot lately. As you guys know, I'm doing a lot with Visa compelling evidence and chargeback management and all these kind of things with fraud deflect. And so that question comes up a lot. It's like, okay, so what data do you have? What do you store? What aren't you storing? What's in your CRM? What's in your systems, etc. And then even as important, what are you passing to other partners, such as your processor or your ISO, your gateway? It's super important to think about how you're going to use these things in the future as you do these integrations, if you're in the engineering side or product, but also just if you're the fraud guy at a company or at one of these kind of partner companies, you need to think about the fact that really data is super cheap to store now. It used to be expensive, and you had all sorts of limits on what you could pass as far as just the byte sizes, but nowadays you don't. Nowadays, data is pennies a gigabyte, depending on how and where you store it. It can be even cheaper. And so we don't need to worry about that so much. The biggest thing to worry about now is privacy and all the regulations around that. So what my general advice to merchants and really anybody in the space is kind of two-sided. Is one, on one side, it's store everything. Right? The more data you have, the more info you have, the better you can do your job. But on the other side, on the regulation side, the conservative side, would be only store things you need. Now, there's got to be middle ground. So, kind of a few tips around that middle ground is I always say, okay, think about, so you want this data, maybe you're not sure you need it, but you want it. And look at that data and decide, could you store it in a hash? And, if you're not an engineer, think of a hash as data that's encrypted, but you can't actually decrypt it. So you can use it basically for comparison. And you just tell that to your engineers, they'll know what I'm talking about. But it's one good middle ground that, say, for example, I've had companies say, well, we don't want to store first 6 and last 4. But yet you kind of need that in a lot of ways for customer support, for fraud. So one thing, if you hash it, and kind of call it layman's terms, you're basically given a token for each of those things. And you can create that token on the fly and then compare it with the stored tokens. So, simple way to think about it, it'll let you store that data. Now, do you need to encrypt or hash those values? Really depends on how conservative you want to be. Some would say don't store them together, for example. It just depends. So, think about that. Think about, if also like separating data, like I just said, you don't have to store it all in the exact same place. So if there is a breach, you can get at that data, or the person that breaches you could get at it, but they got to put it back together. And so it makes it less risky. The hash is way less risky. And just to finish that thought is for encryption. If it's encrypted, it's pretty safe, but could that encryption be broken? People are pretty worried about that with things like, quantum computing, because if we get really fast, it gets easier to break encryptions. But hashing, it's almost impossible, especially if you use a good hash, and your engineers will know how to do that. So think about that. Now, more on the high level side and more of the fraud and risk job, think about all these new tools. Like I keep saying, data is important. You need all this information. And so as we look at what's coming in the future and what's here now, like Visa Compelling Evidence 3, there's a lot of data needed for these things. And we need to be able to respond very quickly in real time with them, either via a provider like Fraud Deflect or internally. And if you don't have that data, it's really tough to go back and get it. It might be impossible. A good example is with Compelling Evidence 3. I think one of the key fields that I'm suggesting my merchants store nowadays is a device fingerprint. Now, if you don't have that, your fraud provider probably does. If they don't, or you don't use it, we actually are offering one that's really inexpensive and I think we'll do the job well. So far, it looks like it does. So that's something. You also want to store IP. This is something with one partner or a number of partners I'm seeing is that a lot of times merchants aren't passing an IP into their gateway, or they pass the IP of their local server. You really need to be passing that IP, and you need to be getting it from your consumer. So whenever they initially authorize that transaction, you want that IP address, and send that to your processor, your ISO, your gateway, your CRM, along with device fingerprint, hopefully if they have a field for it. Otherwise, store it locally, or if you get it from us, we store it for you too. So think about all these different data points. Think about how you would fight a chargeback, how you would fight against fraud. What data points might you need, and then how should you store them? So good data in, good data out. If you need help with this, let me know. Hopefully this helps. Thanks a lot.